A warning, this episode may be distressing for some listeners. We will be covering the subject of murder and rape towards the end of the episode.
Good morning, Warsaw. Today is Sunday, 6th of August. It will be sunny all day with highs of 18 degrees Celsius. That's 64 degrees Fahrenheit for our American listeners. Sunrise will be at 5:19 a.m. and sunset at 8:35 p.m. We are on the 6th day of the Warsaw Uprising. A new transit camp is established today, and we will hear more about this during the podcast. But what else is going on?
Thank you so much for that intro, Philippe. Yes, there will be a transit camp opening on this day, and Roger will tell us a little bit more about it later. But Claire, let's start with, first of all, what's happening on the ground today. Where are we? What are the insurgents doing?
Already the insurgents are quite exhausted. They are circling around. On the other side, we have reinforcements from the Germans. Zoe, who is on the ground as a quartermaster here, she talks about seeing the fresh and boastful faces of the Germans coming in. So they've got new people while the insurgents are getting more and more exhausted. And their supplies are running down as well. So there is no real front line at the moment. And so trying to transport goods and supplies, and this isn't just arms and ammunition, because there's a lot of obviously homemade bombs, petrol bombs and other equipment, even machine guns and so on that they've been producing. But it's also, we're down to the concerns about food and water already at the end of the first week. And then rather fantastically at this point, the insurgents do have some luck. The Germans have been bombing, and they've bombed the large brewery in Warsaw, which is called Haberbusch and Schiele. And that's been set alight. And during the Nazi occupation, obviously, the Germans have taken most of the Polish supplies. And so there have been people who are trying to keep supplies in preparation for an uprising. So there are large warehouses, but some of the main ones are actually still in Nazi German held territory. So the insurgents don't have access to that. But because the brewery is taken, that gives them a huge amount actually of grain and also some sugar that is used for the production of beer. And so this is hugely important for them. It's largely barley and sugar. They think they can feed the civilian and the military population for several weeks on this supply. But getting to the brewery still means going through an area of great fighting, street fighting. And Zoe is one of the many teams, largely women, but not only women, who go out to collect and distribute what they can of the barley and sugar there. And so that means going out through areas first that the Poles, the Home Army, do hold. There are sentries at certain areas, and they will direct them which way to go that's safest. But beyond the very centre of the city, they have to fan out. There's still a lot of gunfire fighting in the streets. I think a lot of them are actually quite amazed because compared to the centre of the town, the centre of the city, a lot of these streets are fairly undamaged. There's still some electric lighting up. It seems quite miraculous to the people going out. But they have to go through areas of gunfire as well. So it is incredibly dangerous. When they get there, they're all carrying backpacks, rucksacks. They've got other bags and cases as well, whatever they could take. And they fill them with these 70-pound sacks of grain, which they then transport to the nearest combat unit, but also across the city to these community kitchens that have been set up to feed the population. And there's loads of other problems with it. It's not a total panacea or a solution. For a start, they don't have any milling facilities, so they then have to take this grain and they're grinding it in coffee grinders to try and produce something that they can then cook. They boil it up, they make it into this thin sort of gruel-like soup, and they add a little bit of the sugar, or they've got some salt and pepper captured from German rations, so they can add that to it. But it's universally hated. It's quite disgusting, I think, this very thin gruel-like soup. One of the insurgents, a man who's taken the code name of Rum, he calls it spit soup because they have to spit out the husks of the barley. I mean, everything now has got dust and dirt and little bits of mortar in from all, it's very hard to filter all of that out. So it's something, and it keeps them going, but it's pretty desperate. And then they use the empty sacks, they fill them with rubble to help fill the barricades. And you see people then are knifing them open just in desperate hope of finding a little bit of extra barley. I mean, it's already at the end of the first week. It's a pretty desperate situation.
What's really interesting is that the situation does get marginally better. And Roger, that brings you into the conversation because the sewer connection is finally established on this day, isn't it?
Yeah, it's interesting that just listening to what Claire was saying about how the difficulties of keeping the insurgents supplied. And one of the problems that they faced was that a lot of the areas that the insurgents held in Warsaw at this point were not contiguous, were sort of interspersed by areas held by the Germans. So they actually had this problem of not only supply but also of communication between those areas held by the insurgents. And one of the methods that they hit upon to get around that problem was to use the sewerage system as a sort of conduit for communication, for supply, and everything else. Now, the problem there, of course, is that the sewage system is at best about 3 feet in diameter, the sewage tunnels. So yes, of course, you can transit through that as an individual, but it's a pretty messy business. The sewage system, of course, is still working, so it's still full of sewage, it's still draining. So it's an extremely messy business and very extremely trying business. But this was, quite widely used by the insurgents from around this time, that first week onwards. And some of the connections were really, quite extensive. So sort of, kilometers of sewage systems between individual manholes that they knew that they could transit through to these areas. And they even had, handwritten sort of signs up in the sewage system so that people didn't get lost and go down sort of dead ends and so on. So it really became a sort of vital method of communication and supply throughout the rising.
Roger, you're right. These connections were really extensive and absolutely kilometres of a distance. But I want to add the woman who actually discovered this, and it was on this day, and it's Elżbieta Gross. She's the one who made contact with the cut-off Mokotów district. I don't know if people remember when we were talking about the phone lines a couple of days earlier. Well, this is how they got round it. And it's really interesting because moving above ground is just too dangerous. And the next problem they face is that sewers were blocked. So they brought in sappers and an engineer, actually, Alexander Chrzanowski. What's very interesting about him is that during the interwar period, he's actually one of the engineers who designed and built the modern day Warsaw sewer system. So they managed to clear the sewer and it allowed the water to drain out because it was filled with water and mud and debris and all sorts of things. And it managed to connect them to Śródmieście, so the midtown, where they could pass on information to the district commanders on the situations in Mokotów. So it allowed insurgent units to finally be able to connect with each other. And I just want to add a little bit more about Elżbieta Gross, is that she was an instructor in the Grey Ranks during the interwar period and a communications officer at the Women's Military Service. Throughout the uprising, she was in charge of the special communications. So basically organising sewer patrols with messengers, maintaining communications between the Midtown and the Mokotów district in the south.
A lot of that down there, I mean, that includes debris from the bombing. So there is broken wood, there's broken glass, there are dead rats, there is, disease down there. And then, of course, eventually the Germans realise what's going on, that this sewage system is being used like that. I mean, they're wondering how the resistors can suddenly turn up behind them. How did they get there without going through our line or across that barricade or whatever? And so eventually, of course, they work it out. And then you get the added difficulty because the Germans are listening. They're listening at the manholes. And when they hear that people are coming down, they will machine gun down, or they will drop down poison gas, or they will drop down a hand grenade, or they blocked certain parts of the sewers so that they would flood and people would be drowned, or they just, close the endings, the manholes, so people couldn't get out again. So, I mean, incredibly horrendous conditions. But
we will come back to the sewers later in August, but for now, Philip kind of gave the game away a little bit earlier, and he mentioned that a new transit camp is being opened. and that's Gulag 121 in Pruszków. Roger, talk to us about that. What is Pruszków? What is it all about, and why is it opened?
Yeah, Pruszków. It's a very important part of the narrative going forward, right to the end of the Warsaw Rising and beyond, and it became the sort of the main transit point for all of those. We have to say, in retrospect, fortunate enough to have been evacuated or deported from Warsaw by the Germans. It was established in a railway repair works initially down in the southwest of Warsaw, Pruszków, as you say. It was a pretty huge site, sort of hastily erected sort of concrete walls and so on, and basically served that purpose as a transit camp. So you'd be there probably for 2 or 3 days to be processed, often in the most trying conditions. So really no sort of sanitary conditions at all. Really basic and really primitive, and often with extremely harsh treatment from the Germans as well. So you'd be there processed for about 2 or 3 days before you were deported onwards. A lot of those deportees, of course, ended up in places like Auschwitz. There was a sort of subsection of Auschwitz II, which was established for female deportees from Warsaw in the autumn of 1944. There was also a subsection of Belsen, which was set aside for deportees from Warsaw. So they were sort of spreading these poor individuals right across the concentration camp system without really an idea of what to do with them. They were merely sort of getting them out of the way to a large extent. But again, this was done, we could say, with extreme prejudice. So, as I said, conditions in Pruszków were horrific, and conditions onwards when they arrived at places like Auschwitz-Birkenau or Belsen, indeed, were no less horrific. So it really became one of those sort of signal experiences for people that went through the Warsaw Rising, was to pass through Pruszków, and that experience very often was extremely trying.
And here is a really good testimony by Helena Kowalska, who was at Pruszków and witnessed all the people arriving there.
On the very first day, when the transport came, kind-hearted people from Pruszków tried to help, handing the Warsawians some food on the trains. The people from Warsaw looked awful, packed in like sardines in various types of clothes, some barefoot and wearing underwear only, hungry, thirsty, terrified, and completely terrorized. They were heading in an unknown direction. They were being told by some escorting gendarmes that they were going as Jews to the crematorium. People didn't know what was to become of them. They were being guarded by the gendarmes as the Ukrainian soldiers. Usually, we were allowed to hand the people food, but the atmosphere was filled with terror. Shots were being fired now and then. There was a lot of screaming and people being hit with the rifle butts.
So we've got civilians going into Pruszków and being deported to concentration camps, forced labour camps, and into unknown places. And on the other hand, the murder of the civilian population is still going on in the districts of Wola and Ochota, exactly what we were talking about yesterday. And we only touched the tip of the iceberg yesterday. So we may as well continue talking about what happens to these people and their experiences. Roger, what else are the Germans doing to the civilians?
Yeah, this is one of the most gruesome, really, of the episodes of this whole period, was the treatment by the Germans or by German Allied forces that those Dirlewanger Brigade, the Rona forces also involved, treatment of the patients and the staff of those hospitals. Really quite horrific, and we touched on it before the previous day about this, but on the 6th it becomes much more sort of grievous. And essentially, they go in with a policy of taking no prisoners. The staff are generally, very roughly treated. In many cases, sort of pushed out into the street outside, where in many cases they're machine gunned anyway. And then they proceed from floor to floor in these hospitals, essentially shooting the patients in their beds. After which, routinely, the buildings are set on fire. So any of those that survived that onslaught obviously would succumb to the building burning around them. So it's absolutely horrific scene. slaughter of some of the most vulnerable of Warsaw society. And bear in mind, of course, that the conditions in those hospitals already, after sort of best part of a week of the rising, after the period of the occupation, conditions were not brilliant at the beginning, but obviously when they go in and completely ransack and slaughter those patients in their beds, absolutely horrific scenes.
And it was Czesław Stefański at the Radium Institute who witnessed exactly everything that you've just mentioned, Roger. Absolutely horrific.
On the 6th of August, while I was in the corridor of a cellar beneath the main building of the institute, together with a young man from the Home Army and a male civilian tending to the sick woman, I saw a soldier rape one of the female patients who had been receiving treatment at the hospital even before the outbreak of the uprising. I heard the cries of the very sick woman in the corridor while she was being raped. Suddenly, one of the female nurses, Danka, burst into the cellar, trying to escape from a harassing soldier. She hid herself in the pile of coal. She was closely followed by two drunken soldiers, their weapons at the ready. They asked where the nurse had gone. I pointed in the opposite direction. The soldiers returned a while later, extremely excited, and told everyone present to raise their arms. Whereafter, one of them fired off a shot that hit my hand. The second bullet hit the male civilian, killing him instantly. The soldier shot at the insurgents but missed. Together we escaped to the boiler room where we found refuge in the chimney duct.
And that is the end of the podcast for today. Thank you so much for joining us. Apologies for some of the harder topics we've had to discuss, but we have decided we will not be masking any part of this history, and everybody deserves to know what actually happened to these people. Thank you so much for listening, and we will see you tomorrow for day 7.